As Donald becomes president, he will never leave office peacefully. He will seek to become our dictator, and he's now said he intends to become our dictator. He then says, well, just for one day. And if you can show me any dictator in the world who gave up their power other than by death, assassination, or being removed by the people around them, I'll give $1,000 to your favorite charity. And that's a no-risk bet because nobody becomes dictator for a day. Whether that issue will motivate voters, we don't know.
The United States Supreme Court says it will decide whether Donald Trump can be forced off the ballot over his efforts to try to overturn his defeat in the 2020 election. Now, the 9 justices of the Supreme Court have agreed to hear Trump's appeal against a ruling in Colorado's Supreme Court, which barred him from the Republican primary race there. The state's Supreme Court decided last month that the former president was disqualified under a clause of the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, brought in after the Civil War, because he had engaged in insurrection, quote unquote, by encouraging the riots at the U.S. Capitol, which took place exactly 3 years ago today. Well, David Cay Johnston is an investigative journalist and author of The Making of Donald Trump.
The Supreme Court will hear arguments on February 8th about the Colorado Supreme Court decision upholding the trial court decision that Donald Trump does not qualify to be on the ballot. To be president of the United States, you have to be 35 years old, a natural-born citizen, and resident in the country for 14 years, and you must not have participated in a rebellion or insurrection or, and I think this is crucial, given aid or comfort to an insurrection or rebellion. And since Donald Trump for 3 hours in the White House did nothing to stop the attack on the Capitol with people screaming to hang his vice president, Mike Pence, and kill Speaker Nancy Pelosi, I think it's beyond question that he gave aid and he gave comfort to the insurrectionists, which makes him unqualified. But will the Supreme Court see it that way? Who knows?
Well, that is the point, isn't it? Will it also have to decide on whether what happened on January the 6th, 2021, whether it actually was an insurrection in the first place?
That is an argument being put forth by the Trump people that, after all, as one congressman said the other day, this only went on for a few hours. Well, there are coups all around the world that only take a few hours. The fact that this was somewhat of a clown show operation is one thing, but let's remember the largest criminal prosecutions in the history of the United States are over January 6th. There are more than 1,000 defendants, and there have been prison sentences handed out that are more than 20 years. So certainly, I think you'd have a very hard time making the case that there was no insurrection or rebellion, because the purpose of this attack was to prevent the peaceful transition of power to the lawfully elected president.
And this isn't the only case concerning January the 6th that's likely to end up before the Supreme Court, is it? Because, of course, there are federal criminal charges against Donald Trump concerning this as well, which may well end up before that court.
Yes. In the January 6th case brought by Jack Smith, the special prosecutor, Donald Trump is asserting that because he was president, anything he did as president cannot be prosecuted. Here's the problem with that. If the court were to accept that, then a president of the United States who loses an election could simply direct that the army go and kill his opponent. That any journalist who says something he doesn't like, he sends the FBI and says, assassinate that person. You cannot have a democracy in a system where the president of the United States or anyone else is exempt from criminal law and civil law. You certainly need to have some rules to protect the executive under the U.S. Constitution while in office. You don't want a prosecutor in who knows where county in the middle of nowhere to be able to tie the president up while he's in office. But clearly, you cannot allow a system where the president can murder his opponents, and that is exactly what happens if the Supreme Court adopts Donald Trump's point. In fact, Joe Biden could simply say, I'm going to stay in office, which is what Donald tried to do unsuccessfully.
And David, just lastly on the legal process before we get on to the political ramifications. The Supreme Court, of course, has three, I think, Trump appointees on it. So,
Correct.
Everyone's trying to guess which way it might lean.
Well, I don't think that's a good way to measure this because that assumes that these are craven people. There's one Supreme Court justice who I think is pretty clear is craven and corrupt, Clarence Thomas, but he was appointed by George Herbert Walker Bush 30 years ago. The two of the Trump appointees, Kavanaugh and Gorsuch, along with some of the other justices, believe that they must interpret the Constitution as it was written and as the amendments were written. And so, for example, in the insurrection matter, the 14th Amendment's Article 3, Section 3, was adopted right after the Civil War to make sure that the leaders of the Confederacy who attacked the United States would not turn around and run the Union after they were defeated.
And on to the politics of it all. Let's look at how it all plays with the different electorates, the so-called bases. From the Trump side, it seems every charge, every indictment only seems to increase his popularity.
Among people who see Donald Trump as, to use his own words, their savior, there's no question that anything that's done to rein him in is going to strengthen their resolve. I don't believe we should give much reliance to the polls showing that Trump is doing very well for two reasons. First of all, fewer than 1% of people who are contacted by pollsters are responding to the pollster. Normally, you want a much larger share of people, a quarter, for example, of them to respond. So I don't think that the polls are reliable. And people like John Geraci, a pollster who wrote a book about this, side with me in this view. Secondly, if Barack Obama, if there'd been a vote at the same point in Barack Obama's first term, he would have lost because all the polls said he had no chance of winning a second term, and he did quite well winning a second term. So I think it's much too early. The real issue in our politics in America is going to be who is going to turn out the vote. We are far from having universal voting in the United States. And if either side is able to turn out, particularly in 13 states that have a very good chance of going one way or the other, turn out a large number of voters, that's going to determine the election. Donald Trump will lose, Dermot, absolutely lose the popular vote. He lost it in 16, he lost it in 20. But because the American Electoral College system, which gives tremendous weight to small, lightly populated states like Wyoming, if he can win a number of those states, he can get back in through the Electoral College, which is what he did in 2016.
Well, David, will this issue, January the 6th, will this issue turn out the Democratic vote? We heard President Biden, of course, last night speaking in Philadelphia, in many respects, the cradle of American democracy. There was no randomness about the choice of that location, was there? And President Biden was saying, putting it on the table, that the American democracy is at stake here in this election, that if Donald Trump gets in again, he will basically try and become what he's been talking about throughout his time over the last 4 years, become a dictator.
Well, Biden and the Democrats absolutely want to frame this election in terms of, do you believe in democracy or do you want a dictatorship? Now, way back in 2015, I said, and I've known and written about Donald since 1988, I said if Donald becomes president, he will never leave office peacefully. He will seek to become our dictator. And he's now said he intends to become our dictator. He then says, well, just for one day. And if you can show me any dictator in the world who gave up their power other than by death, assassination, or being removed by the people around them, I'll give $1,000 to your favorite charity. And that's a no-risk bet because nobody becomes dictator for a day. Whether that issue will motivate voters, we don't know.
David Cay Johnston there on the election year ahead in the United States.